But I thought if you think of the concept of eternity and eternal big bangs, big crunches, growths of universes, evolutions of species like humans or other intelligent species, it seems mathematically impossible that another set of brain neurons wouldn't create another you. Not necessarily you as Johnny or me as Liz, but as with reincarnation, a different person or other being that you got to experience being. And when you know, that was not nearly as good as being me or seeing my dad again, but when you assumed the only other option was complete obliteration, I'm like, I'll take that. That seems a lot better, you know? And then that was kind of the game changer because I Googled that. And that's where I found the research of Doctors Ian Stevenson, who passed away, and his protege, Dr. Jim Tucker, professors at the University of Virginia, studying cases, professors of psychiatry, I should say, as well as child psychiatrists, studying cases of kids with past life memories. And they were checking out, and that was just the tip of the research that completely changed my mind. And now I think consciousness most likely is not created by a brain, but stored somewhere in other states we get to experience.
Welcome to Minutes with Mango, Life in Motion. I'm your host, Johnny Mango. This is the place where we inquire about lifestyle, culture, and careers. Weekly, we meet with new guests that make a contribution of their insightful stories about their careers and how those careers impact their lifestyle and culture. Hello, everybody. This is Johnny Mango. Today, we have somebody that has a very interesting story to tell. Her book is WTF Just Happened, and I'll let her explain what WTF means in a few minutes. Please welcome Liz Entin, and she has done exhaustive research on Afterlife, and she's a proud atheist, which those two things don't quite mix together, but here we go. Let's hear from Liz. Hello, Liz.
Hi, Johnny. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about your perspective on life and the afterlife. So you want to give us tell us how you got into this and how you found your way into this?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, in 2015, my dad passed away. And as you said, I'm an atheist, and I'm not really the kind who was ever very staunch about it as a reaction to being raised religious the way a lot of atheists are. I was just raised in a very secular culture. It was just afterlife God was as much of a non-issue as the tooth fairy. I don't I'm culturally Jewish, so we would celebrate holidays, but, anything like God tied into it, half Jewish, half Christian too. So Christmas was about Santa Claus, Hanukkah was about lighting candles and 8 presents and a bit of our historic culture. And, essentially I'll say kind of where I'm at now and what's been the consistent theme, and then I'll go into how I even came to this. But it seems to be, I think, a misconception that people think if there's a God in heaven, there's an afterlife. If there isn't, there is no afterlife. I think just that's absolutely irrelevant. The question is consciousness created by a brain, or is it somehow external to a brain in a type of cloud and downloaded by a brain? And that's really the question, whether anything else, like how it was created, is there one universal consciousness that created all that? Those are completely different questions. Or they could be like branch questions, but really that's the core. And so when my dad was going into hospice, my very first thought was, is it possible to turn back time in any way? For all we know, we are, and we wouldn't know it. And, that led to my reading all about Einstein's theories of time relativity. So my very next thought was, if something as indisputably factual as time isn't the way we think it is, because theoretically you can turn back time, it's just not super easy and not really doable, because it would, playing with time would involve things like traveling at faster than the speed of light. We can't do that, or even close to the speed of light. We don't have the technology. My very next thought was, and at this point, I thought consciousness was created by brain neurons. But I thought if you think of the concept of eternity and eternal big bangs, big crunches, growths of universes, evolutions of species like humans or other intelligent species, it seems mathematically impossible that another set of brain neurons wouldn't create another you. Not necessarily you as Johnny or me as Liz, but as with reincarnation, a different person or other being that you got to experience being. And when that was not nearly as good as being me or seeing my dad again, but when you assumed the only other option was complete obliteration, I'm like, I'll take that. That seems a lot better, And then that was kind of the game changer because I Googled that. And that's where I found the research of doctors Ian Stevenson, who passed away, and his protege, Dr. Jim Tucker, professors at the University of Virginia, studying cases, professors of psychiatry, I should say, as well as child psychiatrists, studying cases of kids with past life memories. And they were checking out, and I was just the tip of the research that completely changed my mind. And now I think consciousness most likely is not created by a brain, but stored somewhere in other states we get to experience.
So what you're saying is that there's something beyond us that is part of us that we just truly don't understand. But it, like you said, it downloads from somewhere, to use a contemporary term.
Yes, into our brain. And us being a human is just one tiny experience of all that we get to experience of different states of consciousness. And we probably get to experience being other humans, I think, too.
So how did this, it wasn't that long ago then that your father passed away. How has this changed your life?
My God. I mean, just drastically, in wonderful and terrible ways. I mean, obviously terrible because I miss my dad a lot. We were very close. In wonderful, I never in a million years would have crossed my mind there could be a type of afterlife. And that's just beyond the best thing I could imagine. And also the people I met along the way. I formed such wonderful friendships and met just incredible people. Because as you could imagine from that first thought of, oh my God, there could be an afterlife after discovering Drs. Stevenson and Jim Tucker, I wasn't just like, okay, that's it. I mean, it became years of research. And it's the most fascinating, mind-blowing type of research you could imagine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But what did they find? Talk about some of the research and what they've done. And I know it's affected you, obviously, but what is it that they've developed and based their theories on?
Wow. Okay. Well, so the first I mentioned, the two doctors who studied cases of kids with past life memories, they would just find the most remarkable. I mean, not every case was this amazing, but there'd be a few where the kids would know stuff about past lives, and then they would research, find the family. I mean, let's give a quick example of the most famous case, the James Leininger case, where a little boy who was about 2 years old had memories of being a World War II pilot. And I'm going to do a very, very shortened version because I know we don't have that much time here. Essentially, he was having nightmares, like remembering plane crashes. He was under 2 years old when this started. And he would draw pictures of plane crashes. And just one tiny part of it that I think really stood out among tons of evidence. He had 3 little army dolls or Air Force dolls. One had red hair, one brown hair, one blonde hair. And he gave them each a name. After lots of research, they had traced who he had been. They found his old army buddies. He was even, able to share memories with them. And the names he had given, the army dolls matched the hair color of 3 men who had been in the Air Force with him. I believe they had passed away, but I'm not sure. They might have been just people he was close with. And that's just remarkable. And they find so many cases that end up verified.
Yeah.
And that was one of the research. And there's other bodies of research, too, that are remarkable that I can go into if you want.
Well, I know many years ago I read a book, and I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was called Life After Life, and it was written by a medical doctor who was experiencing situations in the operating room where patients were when they were under anesthesia, kept talking about how they were leaving their bodies, and they could, the way a lot of them would describe it, they were up on the ceiling looking down and listening to the doctors, and would reference what some of the things that the doctors actually said during the operation. And it was kind of this out-of-body phenomenon experience. And what I'm hearing from you is a little bit similar, but more into the past life reincarnation side of things is what I'm hearing from you.
Well, that was just one part of it. I think what you might be talking about, possibly Dr. Bruce Grayson or Dr. Sam Pernia, near-death experiences, not just under anesthesia. I could be wrong unless you found something I haven't heard yet, but this is when people are clinically dead. There is a whole body research on this, and then they're resuscitated, and they have these remarkable experiences. I mean, and, as I mentioned, they're out, or as you mentioned, out of body. And there's, the beautiful experiences like seeing deceased loved ones, going to the light. And those are beautiful. But I'm most interested in ones that are verified. And there's verified ones I can share if you're interested.
Really? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, here's one. And also I will say about the beautiful part, one thing that is verified is there's a consistency, a lot of consistencies among people who have them. But now this was specifically verified. One of the researchers who studies this is Dr. Bruce Grayson. He is also part of the University of Virginia. It's called the Division of Perceptual Studies, where research department. And that's where Dr. Jim Tucker and Dr. Ian Stevenson are part of. Dr. Bruce Grayson is a psychiatrist, very logical-minded, wouldn't have believed any of this. And very early on in his career, he was a new psychiatrist. He, was really concerned about looking professional. And, sadly, there was a young girl in college who had, I guess, tried to take her own life and overdosed and was in a coma. And he has a talk with her roommate. They're trying to reach her parents. And right before he went in to talk to this young woman's roommate, he looks down and he noticed his coat was unbuttoned and he had a spaghetti stain on his tie. And again, he's like a young doctor just out of residency. He's mortified. He's like, I can't believe I don't look professional. He's trying to clean it, buttons up his coat, has a talk with the roommate. The other girl's completely unconscious in a coma. She ends up, I believe she does end up passing away and being resuscitated. But when she comes back, she said she was out of her body. She teases Dr. Grayson and said she saw him in the other room trying to cover up the spaghetti sauce stain. And it makes fun of him about it. And, she ends up being, okay, and gets the help she needed. And often also people get such a life joy after near-death experience that I believe she was mentally really got a profound joy and love of life again. I'd have to double check on that part. But that was just, there's so many little verified instances where people report conversations that were in their home while they were in the hospital. They report being above their body and describe what the doctors did. It's really amazing.
Yeah. So what's in your book? Describe what's in your book for our listeners. What do you address in your book? And how do you really say it? Is it what the fuck happened?
I usually say what the fuck just happened, because when I started researching all this, I was saying that regularly. I was like, fuck was that? What the fuck just happened? So my book is a bit of, I start with how I first discovered Dr. Jim Tucker, and I take, there's 2 books now in the series. And the first one, WTF Just Happened, a sciencey skeptic explores grief, healing, and evidence of an afterlife. And I start with the beginning, and then through it all, I'm reading about all the research, and I'm like, no, there's no way. There is a catch. There's no way. And so I start getting medium readings there, because there's actually scientific research on mediums where they're put by Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute has put them through quintuple blinded studies where they're getting completely accurate information, and neuroscientists are studying their brains. And I was just like, there's no way. This is bullshit. No way. So I started getting my own medium readings and giving, completely hiding my identity. And some of them were getting really accurate information. And it was just absolutely inexplicable. And I was like, I have to get behind the scenes. And that's what a bit of the story is about. I start meeting some of the mediums, befriending some of them, harassing them with questions. I'm just like, this makes no sense. I'm like, how does this tie into string theory? How did you do that? And there is a group called the Forever Family Foundation, and they have a scientific advisory board of some of the scientific researchers I'd mentioned. They do a science-based testing to certify mediums. And I decided to start volunteering there because I'm like, I'm going to get the behind the scenes. If this is real or if there's a catch, probably there's a catch, but I need to really get behind the scenes. And it's about how I start volunteering with them, which was really a life changer. Like, I get very close with a lot of people there, and, I end up really getting to see behind the scenes, including getting to,
So regarding psychic readings, since you've delved into this,
yes.
There's got to be, what we hear about mediums is it's kind of a flaky thing, and, there's all kinds of different widespread opinions on mediums and psychic people. Do you have any insight into that? Is there a way to determine if a psychic is really a psychic or not?
Yeah. So a lot are fake. I think 1% are fake. I definitely uncovered some fraud researching all this. A lot, I think, are just not as highly skilled where they can do it, but not super evidentially. And then 1% are highly evidential. The ones at Forever Family Foundation have to pass testing to assure they're evidential. So overall, they're really good. I've definitely had readings too with mediums that were not certified that were also amazing. I've had some readings that were terrible. So, I think one thing you can do is I give fake information. And then if, about 15 minutes into the reading, if they're getting nothing, a good medium, an ethical one, will cancel the reading and offer you your money back or offer a different time. So 15 minutes in, every single thing is wrong. Hey, no, and if you've hidden your identity, they can't get anything on you. Have a friend pay, not a family member. Use, a Google Voice number, use a fake email, just hide everything. I even put a VPN on my computer when I would book on websites.
So that's a way to distinguish between maybe legitimate psychics and not legitimate psychics, is to give some false information and see if they follow through on it.
Yeah, just, it doesn't even have to be super fake, just a hidden email. I guess a fake name is good. Yeah, give a fake name, or I'll give Liz and then a fake last name because, there's a million Liz's, and I'll do Liz, Elizabeth. I'll do variations,
Yeah. So what about...
Excuse me.
What about, what have you... Because obviously you went through some grief with the loss of your father.
Yes.
What have you learned about grief in relationship to this afterlife situation?
Oh, it's absolutely, for me, and others have agreed, and I don't want to say this will work for everyone because I think grief is so individual, and everyone suddenly wants to tell you what you need to do once you've had a loss, and that does not mean it will work for you. So I am just speaking for myself. It's just a complete game changer because, before I used to think, okay, so my dad died or anyone died, that was it. They were just completely gone. There was no more of them or their consciousness. They weren't experiencing anything, and they never, ever would again for all of eternity. And I would never see them again. And one day I would be completely wiped out. So now to think that they're kind of in another form and they're still themselves and they're still able to communicate, and we'll be together again one day, and we'll get to do this human thing again one day, as different beings. But this is more just like one experience, like graduating college. If you want to, you don't never see your friends again just because you're not around them. They don't completely vanish off the face of the earth. So it's a little more like that, and that you're moving on to other experiences. And while it can be sad and there's definitely deep grief and you'd rather have them with you, it still really is an absolute life changer for me.
So I've done my own investigation of these types of subjects for a long, long time. I think that's why I was interested in learning about your book and you. Mine goes way back. I lost my father when I was 6 years old, and
I'm so sorry.
talk about an experience. And it really led me on a journey, not quite like yours, and I was raised in Catholicism, and I went to Catholic schools most of my life. And they would always talk about the soul and how the soul was eternal. And I even went to Catholic high school too in Southern California. And I remember asking, and we were taught by priests back in those days, and I remember asking one of the priests, if a soul is eternal and we all have a soul, is there some reason why two souls can't communicate with each other? And he looked at me and he said, I don't really have an answer for that, but it really probably could happen. It was something that I think he'd never contemplated. So here we are years later, and I'm talking to somebody that's done all this investigation and stuff, and I find it interesting that you're coming up with similar thing, that there's some element out there that's not really describable, that there's a connection, and that there's some part of us that tends to go on.
Yeah. And I'll say, you said not really describable. I'll say not really describable yet, because atoms and molecules used to not be really describable. So I think make this more mysterious than it is. And it's more spiritual than it is. And it is mysterious because we don't understand it. No matter what, even the stuff we understand, like atoms and molecules and the forming of life, it's all really ununderstandable. Even if you think that consciousness is created by a brain and there's no afterlife, that's still absolutely inexplicable and remarkable too. So there's parts we don't understand, but we're understanding more and more. So if our consciousness is not part of our body officially and it downloads with us or quantum entangles with us or whatever, that's just how it is. That's the scientific explanation. And I think we probably will be able to understand more. I don't know if we'll ever understand all of it, but we're going to be able to understand a lot more as science gets better and better. I mean, they're doing crazy things now. I heard like lab-grown brains and,
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I find this whole topic very interesting, and I wonder if when we talk about spirituality and the argument for and against spirituality, are we really describing what we're really talking about here? In other words, less about chasing, quote, a God, and more about some existence that's eternal amongst everything and everybody. And let me ask you, does this go beyond humans? Does this go to other organic life? Does this go to, have you learned anything about that?
Yeah. I mean, from the most basic, I've had my animals come in during medium readings, and I've had like weird experiences where like my dog, who was still here after my cat passed, I know she saw my cat, which I can explain. But even like before I get into that, if you even want me to, if this is how brains work, where they're non-physical, and then they entangle with like this brains are physical, but if our consciousness is not physical, it entangles with our brain. That's how brains would work, whether it's a dog brain, a pig brain, a human brain. There wouldn't be two totally different ways brains work. So,
right. So see if I understand that correctly. So our brains may be affected by this. Boy, it's hard to put a word on it.
Brain may be more like a cell phone. You know what I mean? Like, and our consciousness is the cloud.
Right.
And your same data will be on different phones. You know what I mean? And obviously things are different, whether it's an iPhone or an Android, but you'll still get your emails. So it's like our consciousness and who we are is stored in some type of cloud. Does that make sense at all?
Yes. Yeah. No, it does. It does to me, but that's me. But so maybe the info, we'll call it the info from the cloud, affects the brain, which affects our behavior.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think. I mean, it's like who we are is there. It's entangling with our body, having this experience. Some have also used like driving a car. You get out of the car, you're still there. And so it's like our brain is the bodies overall. Actually, from what I keep hearing, we put too much emphasis on our brains. There seems to be stuff in our stomach, our heart, like our whole system. Our body's like a system, like a tool we use to experience being in this dimension on this planet. We already know we only see a tiny portion here, both because of where we are physically, and we know like we only see a small portion of the color spectrum. You know, we know about infrared and ultraviolet that we still can't see, but we know it goes, I'm sure that goes way past that to colors we can't even imagine.
Yeah, the spectrum.
Right.
An unrecognizable spectrum.
Yeah.
And maybe that's somewhere down the road they'll discover that spectrum like they've discovered all the other spectrums that back when we thought the world was flat.
Right. And our sensory input would make us logically think the world's flat. That's how we experience it until we, you know, are able to go into outer space or,
Right.
you know, tools that can measure.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, okay. Well, I have to tell you that I've done, in the course of my life, I've done some hypno-regression, which when I started doing it, I didn't really believe it until I started to hear the tapes of what I was going through. And I did a number of hypno-regression sessions. This is some years ago. And the person that took me through it, as I listened to the tapes, this one life kept coming up and a number of different lives popped up. But this one life kept coming back, a doctor, which I knew the name, and through the tapes, I could hear that the hypnotist would give me suggestions like, this was kind of like 1800s. He would say, do you see an apothecary? Because I was in some kind of busy city. He says, do you see an apothecary? I said, yes. He says, go to the apothecary. And the next thing I know, I'm in like this drugstore. And he says, do you see a newsstand or newspapers in this store? And I said, yes. And he said, what's the headline say? And then he asked me, what's the date? And what blew me away, I didn't know all this when I was being hypnotized, but when I listened to the tapes, what blew me away were the dates and the headlines on topics that I wasn't that familiar with. Ever since then, I've always had this kind of interest in what is this regressive, this past life, future life continuum that we may be on. And so I got to get your book and read it.
Oh my God, please do. And reach out with any questions or thoughts. It sounds like, yeah, I did. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, I've done a lot on this. I mean, not a lot. And I think that, I think you're onto something. And I hope you keep working on it and chasing it and keep figuring it out. And I don't know if in our lifetimes, if they'll really see that spectrum, if there is such a spectrum, but it's fascinating stuff. And I would encourage anybody to read your book, because I think there's a lot of people out there that are touched by this that don't really talk about it.
That's what's so interesting, is because, yeah, it's considered weird. So people don't want to talk about it. But I can't tell you, since writing this, like, people who I never thought would be open to this, ever. Some are like, oh, yeah, I totally think this, and they'll share an experience. Or I'll get almost the opposite, where they're like, okay, I don't believe this. I've never told anyone. But, and then they'll share this absolutely inexplicable experience. And I would say almost all of us have had something like that.
Right. Right. And so it's kind of I'm not so sure why that's like that. Why us human beings behave that way. I had a guest on a few weeks ago that was a shaman, and he talked about how everything comes from within us rather than outside of us. And, there really isn't a lot of bad. It's mostly good. But we've been trained through culture, through religion, to think in terms of good and bad, good and evil. I guess what I'm getting at is, well, here's the bottom line. What I found myself saying, I said, well, that sounds like it sounds like the story of Jesus about how you can make anything happen from within you. And I found myself saying to him, I wonder if the apostles got it screwed up in the messaging, that maybe there's more information there that was totally misinterpreted. In other words, the world was flat, so therefore it's flat. And now we know differently. And I'm thinking with this life continuum information, I think we're starting to learn that maybe there's something there that we didn't recognize before.
Yeah, there seems to be. And from what I hear, people in the past used to have more access to it. I think maybe before things were so distracted, like you hear of indigenous tribes will have experiences where they just know things and can communicate psychically. Who knows,
Yeah.
But I haven't researched that enough to have strong opinions on how much of that is actually verified versus maybe their type of religion or beliefs. But I mean, it's just it seems to be universally people from all different cultures and belief sets have these weird experiences, however they interpret them, whether they are like, oh, that was God and angels, or whether they're like, that didn't really happen. None of this is true. I imagined it, to all the answers in between, but it seems we have these.
I think you're right about it's the interpretation that is distinctive amongst people.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard in my own family, I've heard of relatives seeing other relatives on their deathbed and things like that, and seeing flying horses, all kinds of and okay, well, one can say that's they're just having some kind of illusionary experience, but who really knows?
Well, you mentioned seeing the deceased relatives on their deathbed. There's been evidence of this. It's called deathbed visions, and it's studied. And yes, you can say a lot that it's, your nerve, you're in trauma, you're terrified of dying. It's your brain's way of soothing you. But what's fascinating is there's some verified experiences of this. For example, someone will see a deceased loved one who passed as they themselves are on their deathbed, and the deceased loved one will tell them something. I mean, this isn't frequent, but it happens enough that there's something going on, and they'll tell them something that they didn't know that ends up verified. Like, go tell your son to look in the cabinet and this is there. And then sometimes there's cases where they'll see, this happens both in near-death experiences and deathbed visions. It's rare, but it's happened where among their deceased loved ones that they know are deceased, they'll see someone who they didn't know had passed away. I mean, I can give specific examples of that if you want, or, but, other times this will often happen with young people, sadly, who are passing, is they'll see a person that they don't really know, and they'll be like, oh, this lady's here, and they'll describe them, and their parents will be like, oh my God, that was my grandmother, and she passed before you were born, and just remarkable things, and that's not the norm, but it happens, and, just, do you want me to give one specific example? There's a case, and there's others. This is just, if people want to delve in and read more, but this was, I believe, in the 1800s, so before internet, before phone, before TV, and there were two little girls who were good friends. Before medicine is what it is today, and they were passing of, disease of the time, and they were in different houses, and this little girl, I guess said, I think her friend's name was Jenny, and she kind of passed out and then came back, and she's like, oh, no, Dad, there's Jenny, and she wants me to go play with her, or something like that. And then the little girl died a few hours later. The parents come to find out, quite a few days later, via paper letter, that Jenny, her friend, was also ill and had died that day.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and there's other cases of that, There's a near-death experience case also that Dr. Bruce Grayson had shared, where, when very sad, a young man was in the hospital, and I don't know what happened, but he passes away, and he sees like his grandparents, he sees loved ones, and then he sees one of his favorite nurses while he's he's resuscitated. So he comes back to life. And on the other side, he sees one of his favorite nurses who'd been caring for him in the hospital. And he says to her, like, why are you here? And she's like, tell my parents I'm sorry. And showed him something like a red convertible. And he comes back, he's resuscitated. He ends up sharing the near-death experience, including, he's like, and how weird, amongst all my deceased loved ones, I saw like nurse, I don't know, whatever her name was. And she was young, and the nurses all start hysterically crying. And her parents had bought her like a little convertible that weekend for her birthday. And she passed away in an accident driving it that weekend. Just tragic. But I mean, that's a layer of comfort to think that,
right,
there's something
so
there.
When you talk about a layer of comfort, we're getting back to grief
Yes.
just briefly, and then we got to wrap this up. But
Yeah, of course.
how much of this do you think? Because I've gone through these thought processes myself. How much of this do you think might be what I would call grief rationalization? In other words,
That's yeah.
how are we perceiving this to satisfy our grief and our pain by saying, well, yeah, maybe there is some afterlife. In other words, it's the opposite of what you're thinking, but have you seen any indication of that this might be a process of grief itself?
I mean, that's what I kept thinking along the way. I'm like, oh, I must have imagined this sign or this medium reading being so good. But that's where the data comes in. And do I think sometimes people are doing that? Definitely. If someone's like, my father sent me this feather, and they're like passing through a bird park. Like, there's people who would take any little thing and say it's a sign. But then if they're always there communicating with you, if that is how it works, then they are still there. You're probably just over interpreting something, which is, that's what you need to do. I'm not, no judgment. But that's where the research comes in. That's where scoring, taking medium readings, scoring all the readings, no matter what I want. It's not my imagination that a medium got my dad's name or a specific memory or a hobby. I mean, I can't lie to myself about that if I honestly score. There's neuroscientists that are scanning mediums' brains. And just really quickly, psychic readings are when mediums communicate with living people. Mediumship is when they're communicating with the deceased and the other side. And neuroscientists will discover different brainwave patterns with both types of readings. I mean, you can't comfort yourself with that. You can't comfort yourself with the research that scientists are neutrally doing, where the kids are remembering past lives and, this near-death experience data I gave. So I think you have to, that's where, if you really want to do this seriously, and if you just want comfort, that's great. But that's where you have to start saying, this happened, how could this happen by normal means? And when you start seeing some of the stuff, it's just inexplicable. When you see the amount of people it happened to, it becomes statistically close to impossible.
So you've really taken an objective approach to this from what I'm hearing from you.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the key. That's very important, and that's good to know, especially if you wrote a book. And let's just describe your book one more time. It's WTF Just Happened ? Question mark,
exclamation point.
Okay, exclamation point too. Okay.
Yeah. And they're both, it's 2 books. And the first one is A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. And the tagline on the second one, also WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog. And then I also have a podcast. So
You do? What's your podcast?
WTF Just Happened.
Okay.
All about the afterlife, no woo.
So where can people find your books?
They're everywhere books are sold. The first book is available also in audio. The second book won't be available in audio for a few more months, but You can get them both now in paper and ebook, and the book 1 audiobook. Book 2, if you want to wait till like June or July, hopefully sooner, I'm trying, in audio. They're available everywhere books are sold. You can link to anywhere from my website, WTF Just Happened.
WTFjusthappened.net.
WTFjusthappened.net. Yeah, the initials not spelled out makes
right.
Helps
okay,
me
very good.
I
want to thank you for joining us today. Obviously, you can tell I have an interest in this subject.
Yeah. Oh my God, it's fascinating.
I'm less of a skeptic than maybe some people you run into, but I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts, Liz. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate it.
You have been listening to Minutes with Mango, Life in Motion. Subscribe to hear a new and unique guest each week as they comment on their life's journey and share experiences with lifestyle, culture, and career. You can always find us at minuteswithmango.com.